As the Second World War came to an end across Europe, there were squads of Allied soldiers sent to hunt down Nazis, and to then bring them to justice. Some of the most horrific war criminals did manage to escape the gallows of the hangman, and they did manage to get to South America, and this included the Angel of Death, the infamous head doctor of Auschwitz, Josef Mengele. The post-war trials that occurred, including the Nuremberg trials, brought the crimes of many to the world's attention, and the men who were condemned to death following the Nuremberg trials were dealt with inside of a makeshift execution chamber in rather botching yet successful fashion by US hangman John C. Woods. But one chilling fact about what happened at the end of the Second World War is that some of the most evil Nazis were actually buried rather than cremated, and today their remains are still etched onto the surface of the earth, their bones lying where they were interred decades before. Even the corpse of the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, the man who was responsible for the slaughter of millions of people, is today still lying deep in the ground. This is something that isn't commonly known, as there is a belief that most of the Nazis were cremated. But this isn't the case. In this video we look at the graves of the Nazis that exist still today. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. First of all, a number of executed war criminals at the end of the Second World War were cremated, and their remains were then scattered. The condemned Nuremberg defendants, including Hermann Göring, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, a senior SS official, Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the armed forces, Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former foreign minister, Julius Streicher, a virulent Nazi editor, and a number of others, all following their bungled executions, were cremated in secret by the American army, and their ashes were all scattered in the Isar River, a tributary of the Danube River. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal, the head of the Luftwaffe, and close friend to Adolf Hitler for many years, who did cheat the hangman hours before his execution, was also cremated. The decision to cremate those remains was done to ensure that these burial sites did not become a place of pilgrimage and worship in the post-Nazi Germany. But there are many high-ranking Nazi officials and war criminals whose grave today does still exist on Earth. Heinrich Himmler was the head of the SS, the Reichsführer SS, and he was someone who oversaw the whole of the paramilitary group, who became the guards of the concentration camp, and they also had wings of the armed forces. Himmler was someone who had the blood of millions of people on his hands, and under his leadership the SS was transformed from a mere bodyguard detachment to one of the most feared and deadly groups in history. It was Himmler who was responsible for forming the Einsatzgruppe death squads, and overseeing extermination camps such as Treblinka and Sobibor, and he played a pivotal role in the slaughter of 6 million Jewish people and many minorities during the Holocaust. At the end of the war, Himmler had tried to save his own skin, and he was making shady deals with nations to give over prisoners of the concentration camps, and he tried to portray himself as some sort of saviour. When Hitler discovered this, he was dismissed and sacked of all his posts, as it was also found that he was trying to make peace with the Allies. Rejected by all those around him, Himmler then tried to make a run for it, and he would later on the 21st of May 1945 be seized at a border checkpost by former Soviet POWs. He was giving his name as Heinrich Hitzinger, but it was not long before his ego got the better of him inside of a prisoner of war camp, and he declared his own identity. He was a prisoner of the British, and he was then held inside the headquarters of the 2nd British Army in Lüneburg. But he did have a hidden cyanide capsule upon his person, and during an examination he consumed this, and then collapsed to the floor, and within 15 minutes, the head of the SS was dead. His corpse was photographed lying on the cold floor of the British Army building, but then the decision was undertaken by the British to bury Himmler's remains. It was not common for the British at the time to cremate the bodies of even war criminals, and the hope would have been to bring Himmler to trial if he had survived. But instead, under the cover of darkness, the corpse of Himmler was smuggled out of the building, and was then driven to the nearby Lüneburg Heath, a huge area of woodland and parkland. He was buried in secret by British soldiers, who threw his body into a roughly dug grave, and the area of this was described as very wooded. The body of Himmler was then covered over, and the area was returned to its previous state, as to not attract attention. His grave was left unmarked, and it was also said that no coffin encased his body, meaning that today it would have decomposed very quickly. It was also recorded that British soldiers carried the body, which was swathed in blankets, and then threw it in. A priest did administer the last rites at the side of the grave allegedly, and Himmler, one of the most brutal and powerful men of the Third Reich, is still buried in this secret location on Lüneburg Heath today and has never been found. Reinhard Heydrich, the blonde butcher of Prague, and the man who was considered, one day, to have been possibly Hitler's successor, was the chief of the Reich Security Main Office, and he oversaw the Gestapo, SD and Kripo. He was also the Reich's protector of Bohemia and Moravia, and he was known for being a terror. He would bring horror to the Czech lands, publicly executing suspected resistors, and even Hitler referred to Heydrich as the man with the iron heart, someone who would carry out his dark policies without any hesitation. Heydrich was, throughout the 1930s, rising quickly throughout the ranks of the Nazi Party, and he held a close friendship with Heinrich Himmler, and he was his deputy. Heydrich also was responsible for the Einsatzgruppe death squads, and these were responsible for the slaughter of over 1.3 million people. The true scale of Heydrich's crimes still today are not fully known, as many of the victims still lie in undiscovered mass graves. But the Czech resistance would catch up with him, as British-trained Czech agents mortally wounded him on the 27th of May 1942, and he would succumb to his injuries on the 4th of June 1942. He was 38 years old when he died, and he had two huge Nazi funerals, the first in Prague, and the second took place in Berlin, and was a state occasion. Hitler blamed Heydrich for his death in secret, claiming, since it is the opportunity which makes not only the thief but also the assassin, such heroic gestures as driving the open, unarmed vehicle, or walking about the streets unguarded, are just damned stupidity, which serves the fatherland not one whit. That a man as irreplaceable as Heydrich should expose himself to unnecessary danger, I can only condemn as idiotic and stupid. Heydrich was buried inside of Berlin's Invalidenfriedhof, a long-standing military cemetery. For some time the burial spot of Heydrich was marked, and there was an iron cross grave marker made from wood initially placed, before a larger memorial was made for him, including a bust of his head. But at the end of the Second World War the gravestone and memorials for Heydrich were destroyed, but his remains still lay under the soil inside of the Berlin cemetery today. It is believed within certain circles that the exact spot of Heydrich's interment and grave was very well known, and in 2019 his grave was actually broken into and disturbed. The cemetery officials and police confirmed that this grave was Heydrich's that had been attempted to be broken into, and it's not known what specifically the thieves were looking for, possibly Heydrich's SS officer's sword. Heydrich was interred inside of a coffin, and would have been buried with his full military honours and medals also pinned to his SS uniform. Despite the public outcry at Heydrich's grave being disturbed, there has been no since activity around this area, and there has also been no order to dig up his remains and to deal with them once and for all. Still in Section A, close to the north wall of the Invalidenfriedhof, the remains of the Butcher of Prague are still kept under the earth. Someone who is often considered a forgotten member of the running of the Nazi police state, when compared to Heydrich and Himmler, is Kurt de Luger, the chief of the Order Police. De Luger would later claim that he was beloved by 3 million police officers, and he would, by the outbreak of the Second World War, have 120,000 active police members of the Order Police following his orders. He had, before the war, been involved in carrying out the Night of the Long Knives, the purge of the SA, Hitler's thuggish brown shirts. De Luger's forces brutally arrested and seized many people involved in the resistance against the Nazis, and he would also involve himself in huge deportation orders to the concentration camps. After the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, de Luger was sent in as the deputy acting protector of Bohemia and Moravia to the Czech lands, and he was involved in directing reprisals for Heydrich's death. De Luger with this would order the razing of 2 Czech villages, Lidice and Lezaki, and scores of roundups of the population occurred. Some were executed on the guillotine inside of Czech prisons. Following a serious heart attack, Kurt de Luger was then pensioned off by Hitler, and he lived a rather comfortable last few years, until he was arrested and was then extradited to Czechoslovakia, the land of his crimes. De Luger was put to death and was executed inside of Pankrak prison in Prague on the 24th of October 1946, using pole hanging in front of a large crowd. But rather than cremate his remains, De Luga was quietly interred in an unmarked grave inside of Dablí Cemetery in Prague. The cemetery is rather troublesome, as buried inside the very same cemetery and inside the consecrated ground are the very two assassins that caused Heydrich's death, two men considered heroes today. So buried alongside some of the most heroic Czechs is a terrible war criminal and a Nazi who went to his death unrepentant for his actions. Albert Speer was Hitler's architect and a close personal friend, and the pair would speak long into the night about art and other plans that Hitler had. Hitler almost had an obsession with Speer, and Speer was involved in the inner circle, and he would design and construct important buildings such as the Reich Chancellery, and also the Nazi Party rally grounds at Nuremberg. He was later during World War II appointed the Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, and he believed that he performed a miracle in keeping the German armaments factories as productive as they were, even as the Allied heavy bombing campaigns caused havoc on industry. Speer would at the end of the Second World War be brought to the Nuremberg trials, and he took a different tactic to the rest of the defendants, and he sought to say sorry and apologise for what the Nazis had done, and what he had personally caused. He did not seek to pass the buck, and was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, mostly relating to the use of slave labour inside of German factories. But he did escape the death penalty for this, shockingly. He was locked up inside of Spandau prison for some years, and in 1966 was released, and he then spent the rest of his life on TV shows and living the life of someone who was referred to incorrectly as a good Nazi. Speer managed to rehabilitate his image based on lies and fabrications, and he continued to publish his biographies of his life. In 1981, Albert Speer became very sick, and he suffered a stroke inside of London on the 1st of September 1981. He had at the time been in a relationship with a German woman who was living in London, and he was with her when he died. He had a funeral where only 15 people attended, including his wife and 6 children, inside of his hometown of Heidelberg, and it was said that his funeral was rather quiet. Albert Speer was then, following this, cremated, and his ashes were placed inside of an urn, and these were then buried. They were buried inside of a plot within Heidelberg's Friedhof, and the ashes today are marked by a gravestone. Speer's wife would also be interred here too, as would other family members. Karl Dönitz was the chief of the German Naval High Command, and the Supreme Commander of the Navy during World War II. He was a very experienced commander and officer. He rose throughout the ranks of the Kriegsmarine, right to the very top, and he oversaw the U-boat efforts against Allied shipping. Around 30,000 of the 40,000 men who served on the German U-boats died during World War II, but Dönitz himself was a dedicated and devoted Nazi and a supporter of Hitler. But upon the death of the Führer, Dönitz, in Hitler's last will and testament, was appointed as a successor to him, and as the head of state, taking the position known as the President of Germany, and the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. He reformed a cabinet in Flensburg briefly, before he ordered Alfred Jodl, the chief of the operations staff of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, to sign the German Instruments of Surrender, bringing an end to the Second World War in Europe. Dönitz continued as the President of Germany, but he was seized and then indicted as a war criminal at the Nuremberg trials. His skilled lawyers managed to get him off the death penalty, arguing that the British and other Allied nations had committed war crimes on the high seas, and with this he spent time behind bars inside of Spandau prison, alongside men such as Albert Speer and Rudolf Hess. He was released on the 1st of October 1956 and wrote a number of books, but he remained an unrepentant Nazi. On the 24th of December 1980, at the age of 89, Karl Dönitz died from a heart attack, and his funeral took place on the 6th of January 1981. Many former servicemen and foreign naval officers attended his funeral, and he was interred in the Waldfriedhof Cemetery in Auville. He was not buried with military honours, and service members who attended the funeral were not allowed to wear their uniforms, but there were over 100 men who held the high-ranking Nazi medal and accolade of the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross who were in attendance. Today, Karl Dönitz's grave is marked by a gravestone showing his date of birth and death, and also a stone marking his family plot. but above this is a large cross with Jesus crucified on it, painting a haunting image above the grave. Ernst Röhm was a close friend and ally of Hitler, and he was the early leader of the SA, Hitler's brown shirts, his paramilitary thugs who came before the SS. Röhm's personality and relationship with Hitler was a rather bizarre one, and it was very exclusive, and he was an experienced military officer and official. He was involved in the beer hall putsch, and he was the only person who referred to Hitler as Addy and could get away with it, a nickname he had for him. Röhm's SA got involved in brutal violence against the enemies of the Nazis, and his thugs began to become a real problem for Hitler, as he was seen as unprofessional and a threat to the image of the Nazi party. But Röhm also got incredibly powerful himself, and he was someone who intimidated other members of the Nazi party, and because of this, Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich sought to get rid of him, and during the purge of the Night of the Long Knives, Röhm was executed and shot inside of Stadelheim prison on the 1st of July 1934. Ernst Röhm, following this, was interred inside of a family grave plot in the West Friedhof in Munich. Also buried nearby Röhm is Hans Bauer, who was Hitler's personal pilot, and he at the end of World War II had been imprisoned by the Soviets, and was later extradited to France, and he would die in 1993 in Bavaria. The Hitler Youth was a boys' youth group in which millions of young men joined, and they were trained to later become soldiers, and they would be further indoctrinated with the Nazi ideology. The man who led this was Baldur von Schirach, and he would fight during the Second World War, and also hold various positions as a Gauleiter and regional Nazi leader. He had been responsible for the deportations of most of the Jewish people in Vienna to concentration camps, and he would make brutal and terrifying speeches preaching the Nazi policies. He was virulent in front of a crowd, and his words were poison. His wife surprisingly would be a little bit different, and she even questioned Hitler to his face, but Schirach had visited Mauthausen concentration camp, but he was later taken to the Nuremberg trials. He was indicted for crimes against humanity for his deportations of people to their certain deaths inside of concentration camps, and at the trial he was one of a few people to speak out to denounce Hitler. He later claimed that regarding the Third Reich's actions, it is the greatest, the most devilish mass murder known to history. The murder was ordered by Adolf Hitler, as is obvious from his last will and testament. He and Himmler jointly committed the crime, which for all time will be a stain in the annals of our history. It is a crime which fills every German with shame. Baldur von Schirach was acquitted of crimes against peace, but he was found guilty of crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to 20 years inside of Spandau prison, and his wife divorced him at this time whilst he was behind bars. He had been treated for a blood clot in prison, and later had an operation on his eye, and he was released on the 1st of October 1966, having served out his full sentence. Schirach then, following his release from prison, gave some interviews, but he then moved to a former hotel which was being run by former leaders of the League of German Maidens. Whilst here he drank a lot, and on the 8th of August 1974, at the age of 67, Baldur von Schirach died from coronary thrombosis. He was buried in the Croft Friedhof, and there was a large gravestone marking the site of his burial. This featured his name and a large cross on the side. However, in 2015 the rights for the grave of von Schirach ceased and were not renewed, and with this his gravestone was removed and the ground was flattened. His remains were not exhumed, but his family had waived the right to extend his gravestone and site as a specific place of interment for him. He is, as mentioned, still buried there and was not dug up. Fritz Todt was, during the Third Reich's time in power, the founder of Operation Todt, a military engineering group that supplied German industry with forced labour and also slave labour. He would later serve as the Reich Minister for Armaments and Ammunition, but he was responsible for the construction of the Autobahns and other major projects, including the construction of the Atlantic Wall. He used around 800,000 slave labourers in his organisation, but on the 8th of February 1942, after his aircraft, the Heinkel HE-111, had taken off from the Wolf's Lair headquarters, it crashed and Todt was then instantly killed. He had a large funeral and was buried inside of the Invaliden Friedhof, the very same cemetery that Heydrich is buried in. He was buried with full state and military honours, and his original grave marker was destroyed by the Soviets after the war. But after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Fritz Todt was given for some reason a new grave marker. He was someone who, if he had been brought to Nuremberg, he would probably have been condemned for his use of slave labour. Karl Hermann Frank was a senior Nazi official who worked inside of Czech lands, and he would rise throughout the ranks of the SS. He was inside of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, given command of the SD, Kripo and Gestapo in the Czech region. His forces also fought the partisans who resisted and took up arms against the Germans. He also oversaw large-scale reprisals in which hundreds were executed, and at the end of World War II he was arrested by the American army. He was extradited to Czechoslovakia and was then condemned as a war criminal and was sentenced to death. On the 22nd of May 1946, he was executed by pole hanging in front of a crowd of 5,000. But after Frank's death, he was too taken to Dablis Cemetery and was buried inside the same cemetery as Kurt de Luger is. The pair of Nazi officials who caused chaos and inflicted terror inside of Czech lands are still buried today in an unmarked grave in the cemetery. At the end of World War II, a series of trials took place to punish the guards and former staff who worked inside of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. When the British discovered and liberated the site, they found untold horror all over the place, and amongst the defendants were 45 former SS men, women and capos, or prisoner functionaries, all who had worked at Belsen. Some of these guards and staff became infamous for their actions, such as Josef Kramer, the commandant, the Beast of Belsen, and Irma Gräser, the hyena of Auschwitz. Both were responsible for horrific slaughter and treatment of thousands of people. At the end of the Belsen trials, a number of these men and women were condemned to death. This included Kramer and Gräser, Dr. Fritz Klein, the hitman and executioner Franz Hössler, female guards Elisabeth Volkenrath and Johanna Bormann, as well as some others who had been involved in taking lives. The executions of these men and women took place on the 13th of December 1945 within the walls of Hamelin Prison, as experienced British executioner Albert Pierpoint condemned them on the gallows. But after their executions, they were buried inside of the prison's courtyard, but when the prison was passed back to the German authorities, the bodies were exhumed and were then reburied in Hamelin's Amvel cemetery. These remains and bodies are still in the ground today, where they were buried in an unmarked plot, but they are by a path in the cemetery. Still today the remains of those such as Irma Gräser are interred in this ground. There are a couple of strange cases of high-ranking Nazi officials who were interred in graves for some time, but were then unearthed. Josef Mengele was the angel of death of Auschwitz, the infamous head doctor of Auschwitz, who conducted horrific experiments upon prisoners and selected them to go to their deaths. At the end of the war, Mengele managed to escape down rat lines to South America, and he was very much one of the most wanted men in the world. He managed to live his life inside of Argentina, Brazil and other nations, and he even at some point managed to return to Europe on holiday. But Mengele, living under a false name, died on the 7th of February 1979 whilst he was swimming off a beach in Brazil. He suffered a heart attack and then drowned. Mengele was then buried inside of a nearby cemetery, but he was then buried in the ground for a period of around 6 years. The location of Mengele's grave was revealed to German authorities, and the remains of Mengele were then dug up and unearthed. His bones today are stored inside the Sao Paulo Institute for Forensic Medicine, and are even used as a teaching aid for forensic medicine courses and students to learn anatomy from, using the bones of the angel of death, Josef Mengele. Hess was someone who helped to create and craft the persecution laws of the Nuremberg laws that brought suffering to so many people. But he then went on a strange peace mission, landing in Scotland, and he became a prisoner of war throughout much of the conflict, locked up by the British. But at the Nuremberg trials, because Hess had spent a significant amount of time as a prisoner, he actually missed much of the war at the heart of Hitler's government. Hess would be sent to Spandau prison, escaping the hangman, and he remained there for the rest of his life. He was kept under very close guard, but on the 17th of August 1987, at the age of 93, he died under what has been described as very strange circumstances. Hess was then buried a number of times. He was first buried in a secret location, but this was discovered rather quickly, and it became a site where neo-Nazis demonstrated and then held gatherings. He was then interred inside of the family Hess plot at Wunsiedel, and his wife would later be buried next to him. But the issues around Rudolf Hess's grave continued, and because of this, eventually in July 2011, Hess's body was dug up from the grave and was then cremated, and his ashes were scattered at sea. His gravestone was also destroyed and broken up. There are many more Nazis who remain buried today on Earth, and their remains still lie under the ground. Some are buried inside of cemeteries, some are still interred inside mass graves. For example, during the Battle of Berlin, there are still scores of German soldiers and virulent Nazis buried close to where they fell. This video is just a small part of the story, but 80 years on, many of the most evil war criminals of the Second World War do still exist in some form on Earth today. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.